Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. For this week's video, I want to go through the development of another custom layout design. This design is for another multi-deck HO scale layout in a room that is not quite rectangular. Here is one end of the customer's home plan. This room here is going to be the train room, and we notice that it is right next to a huge garage. I point that out now because it's relevant later. Now, in common with many of the plans produced by home builders for their customers, there is no consistency with the dimensions. Some of them are dimensioned to the outside of walls, some to the middle, and some to the inside. I think that maybe they do this deliberately in an effort to thwart possible lawsuits resulting from walls being built not quite where they say they're going to be. I don't know, I'm only guessing. Now, on the one occasion that I had a house built for me, many years ago, long before I went into the business myself, I designed a layout for the room that was going to be the train room based on the dimensions given to me from the builder's blueprints. And when the house was built, the room was approximately 5 inches smaller in each dimension. And for a typical sized bedroom, that is a significant proportion. And it was very difficult to shave the layout down those few inches without losing anything. Now, my first choice for this design would have been to wait until the house was framed up and he could measure the actual rooms and just make an adjustment for the drywall. But the customer wanted to get on with it, and since I didn't have all the dimensions I needed, I drew out the room for him and asked for him to fill in all the numbers for me, erring on the cautious side just in case we ended up with a room that's a little bit smaller. We figured it's a lot easier to expand the plan a few inches than it is to shave it. Once I got his numbers back from him, I redrew the boundaries using the dimensions he gave me, making sure that the space was drawn smaller rather than larger. Now, if you recall from the home plan, the walls along the top and left are exterior walls, and this door was being added specifically as a materials door. The spec I was given was that I can block this off completely because it will be closed permanently once all his benchwork material is in the room. Now, the specifications that I was given was for long diesel hauled trains over a double track main line. So I wanted to use a decent sized curve. Originally I started off using a 3-foot minimum radius on the inside track, but later ended up shaving it to 33 inches because it wasn't possible to get two of the 36-inch double track radius curves side by side in this end of the room. Now, when the room is built, we may end up with a few more inches, but we don't want to bank on it. Here's one design I drew for a folded dog bone within the room, avoiding crossing in front of the doorway. Here's another variation that makes somewhat better use of this end of the room and allows for a small branch line. And here's another design with a moving section across in front of the entrance. It's a much longer peninsula because we no longer have this second turn back curve in this corner. And it does make somewhat better use of the space. So I sent these 3 ideas off to the customer, and he sent back a sketch of something that he wanted to include. He wanted a peninsula facing the doorway with a main street scene within the loop of track, a roundabout and a flagpole. So I sketched some designs to see what was possible with this kind of a peninsula location. As this plan demonstrates, what this does is cuts all the nice long straight areas into short sections which are less suitable for a workable railroad, and the peninsula running sideways in the room isn't quite long enough to get the curve all the way back and then round again, so we end up with this huge unusable space in the middle. And we've now got 3 blobs, 4 if you count the base of this peninsula, which really does waste a lot of space. I tried another variation to see if I could mitigate these problems somewhat, putting the peninsula in from the other end. And although we have at least managed to regain the long wall to use for our yard, it's still not an efficient use of the space. So I drew one more sketch showing how his main street scene could be incorporated into the side of a longitudinal peninsula in accordance with the 3rd sketch that I drew. Now, of course, since this is the only blob in the room, it has to contain the helix, which means that his main street scene has to be on the upper deck. Although at this point I asked if he was okay with moving the helix into the garage, and he jumped at that idea. And it really made a huge difference to the plan, as instead of having this entire center section wiped out on all but the top deck for the helix, we now were able to incorporate wide scenes on each deck. Now, as for a layout schematic, the customer wanted a long end-to-end main line, but he also wanted a minimum of 3 continuous loops for running trains. Now, rather than put a triple track main on one deck, I suggested that we had a double track main line on one deck and a single track on the other. And he also thought that was a good idea. And large staging yards were also necessary because the client already has a huge car and locomotive roster, and that is of course going to continue to grow over time. So with the layout footprint pretty much set, let's start filling in the routes. Here is the lower staging level, the helix in the garage. I did think about putting it in this corner, but that would have been in the middle of his back wall. Not only is it nearer the corner of the garage and therefore going to take up less space, but it's also a shorter walk from his train room if he has to go in here to rescue a train or something like that. So at the bottom of the helix, we run around the end of the room and use the long wall for a staging yard and the peninsula for a reversing loop. And since the client had already mentioned that he loves bridges, especially big bridges and deep canyons, I thought this was a good opportunity to bring this section out into the open, make it scenic, because on a multi-deck layout you can't really put deep canyons on anything but the lowest deck. Here is the second deck, which is going to be mainly built up with the main yard along the long wall. We'll put some industry on the peninsula, some open running, and then a double track cut-off to give him his continuous circuits, even though all the other track on this level is part of a long end-to-end run. And then heading to the upper scenic deck, we come out of staging, run around the same route again, back into the helix, and then go above head height to the east end staging yard, also along the long wall with a reversing loop. And since this is well above door height, we don't have to worry about crossing over the aisle because even the tallest operators could just walk straight under it. And it helps here having a 9-foot ceiling in his room. Eventually I made good use of every inch of height that he had. So with the single track continuous circuit on the upper scenic deck, the double track circuit on the lower scenic deck, and another possible circuit on the lower staging level using a second reverse loop under the helix, he now has a total of 4 continuous loops, and he really liked that. He did make one request on the upper scenic level. We talked about the possibility of going with a twice round loop, gradually climbing so that the second lap could be above eye level, thus giving plenty of opportunities for additional bridges with some height to them. Okay, here is that upper level with the twice round main line. Note that I continued the double track to the top of this helix to ease congestion. So we end the double track just as we come into view again, staying level most of the way around the first circuit, only climbing when we get to the end. We now cross over, make a second circuit around the room, gradually climbing until at this point we are fully 6 feet above the floor, allowing for some decent height canyons. The point-to-point main line continues along the wall into the final helix, while the continuous cutoff has to drop via a 1.5 lap helix back down to start height again. I had to come all the way to the front of the benchwork here on a tall trestle. And in this location, I have the tracks crossing over and under each other more than I would have liked. But with the request for the twice round main line, it was unavoidable. It did make for some challenging scenery in this corner, but the customer is very happy with the way it ultimately turned out. Here is the lower scenic level with most of the track roughed in, showing how he gets his 4-track Union Station behind the freight yard in front, the engine terminal that he wanted, and a good-sized industrial suburb. He wanted multiple passenger stations, Originally he asked for 2 complete cities, representing Salt Lake City and Denver, but I managed to talk him into representing one of them with staging. Otherwise it would have filled the room and not allowed for any open running between them. I did, however, squeeze in a second passenger station. We have a small suburban station, far enough away from the main station to give the commuter trains a reasonable run between them. And in this corner of the room, with nothing below it, there's the possibility of putting in one fairly deep canyon on this level as well. Here is the lower staging deck with the staging yards drawn in accurately. Now the client has a huge amount of code 100 track and Atlas switches that he wanted me to use up. Originally he specified that we use the code 100 track on the entire layout, but then once we realized that the staging areas and the helixes would use up most of it, we decided that we had the option of going for something that looks a lot nicer on the visible portion. Although this entire level, including the scenic portion, is using the code 100 track. It's so low and so far from eye level anyway that unless you bend down for a closer look, it won't draw attention to itself. In addition to the main staging yard, I've also included some spurs for additional locomotive storage and some secondary storage tracks bent around the south side of the room. He asked for 1 spur leading to his workbench, which I also put in this corner. Although when I started working out the elevations for the various decks, I realized that this was going to be rather low for a workbench. So I suggested eliminating this front track and then cutting in a curved turnout on the first or second lap of the helix, leading to 1 or more spurs on his workbench. So now not only can it be the ideal height, but it can be the full 32-inch depth. So he's got plenty of space there. And even with these extra 6 additional storage tracks at the back, there's still enough knee space. Now most of his staging tracks are in the 12 to 13 foot range, although I did take the opportunity to include 3 really long tracks around the back for extra long through trains. And then after I drew this, I was wondering whether I could have made them even longer by wrapping around this end as well. I will come back to that. Here I'm starting to fill in some structures as well. I drew some industries on the peninsula, including a single large industry that has potential for a lot of interesting switching. And I showed 5 different ways in which aisle side industries could be handled. One is just a lead track leading off into the aisle, implying that the industry is further away. Secondly, a loading dock by itself, implying that the structure is in the aisle. Third, some chemical storage tanks, also implying more to the industry than is modelled. And then the front of a cut-open warehouse, which I've started specifying on a lot of my layout plans recently, because I've seen some cases where people have modelled that very convincingly. It makes for an interesting talking point. And then lastly, just a blank spur with a driveway beside it, implying that the entire industry is in the aisle. Now the customer has a lot of small main street built up structures, so I enlarged his original scene with a long street running the length of the peninsula, allowing him plenty of room to incorporate all the structures that he has. Note that I'm not trying to position them accurately at this point. I just left him plenty of room and suggested that when the time comes and he has the benchwork ready, that he just experiments in full-size 3D to see what he likes best. At this point I've put in one industry that was a must-have for him. He has a salt loader that goes over a track with another track beside it. He wanted a little bit of the salt flats and salt piles. Now the photograph that he sent me of the prototype industry has piles that are significantly larger than this, but there really isn't room for them without taking up an entire corner of the railroad, which would have been a waste of space. So we've just got a representation of some smaller than normal salt piles as being the best compromise to fit everything in. Now we both knew that we wanted another significant industry in this area, but at this point I wasn't quite sure how to make it work. So I delayed that for the next iteration until I had some more time to think about it. Here is the upper scenic level with the secondary track drawn in. So I've included one small intermediate town immediately upon coming out of the helix. Now, since the main line at this point goes from single to double track, we can get away with a much shorter passing siding because the remainder of the train can be left on the second main line and an opposing train can still pass it. I've put a second small town on this side of the peninsula, and here we have a significant sized mine making good use of the wide spot here, and a pulpwood loading spur at this end, because pulpwood loads always look really cool. There's a third passing location along the end with just a single spur. Here it's labelled as a team track. On later plans I labelled it as another pulpwood location. And note how it's right at the front, because at this point the track is at an elevation that makes operation a little more challenging. And then of course the second lap there is no switching, although there is this long passing siding around in this alcove, because otherwise there would be several miles of main line with no passing points. At this point the elevation is going to be well above eye level. One of the reasons why I resisted the temptation to put spurs off it. The other one is that these two benchwork runs are occupied by the main switching areas on the lower deck, and therefore this aisle is likely to be full of operators switching those areas. So by eliminating the need for switching on the upper deck, it helps to ease operator congestion in this aisle. And then on the helix coming down there is the opportunity for a very long passing siding. Of course it's 1.5 laps. It ends up at 29 feet, which is slightly less than my extra long through train storage tracks, which were in the 33-foot range. Here is the sky staging with those 3 long tracks there, and then a redesign of the lower level staging with the 3 long tracks extended a little bit further at this end. If I'd had curved turnouts available, I could have got them slightly longer. They're already long enough for trains a scale half-mile long. We elected not to use his Atlas curved turnouts because they have a 22-inch radius on the inside, and we'd already settled on a much larger radius than that. So he'll probably eventually just put those up on eBay along with all his sectional curves. So now with all the main elements of the layout fleshed out, it's time to start adding the details and the scenery. Here is that scenic section on the bottom level drawn in. I added an extra bridge at this point, and I've shown 2 areas where the scenery can reach all the way to the floor. This stream can follow the track for a considerable distance and then drop over a series of waterfalls down to floor level, and then another deep canyon at this point. One of the first scenes that'll be seen as you walk into the room. And although it would in theory be possible to make this section the full width of the peninsula, not only would that be too wide to reach into conveniently, but also I wanted to pull the backdrop forward and allow some room for some structure behind it. I figure the bottom deck of the peninsula will be built as a conventional open grid table, with the joist running across it, and then behind the backdrop there's room for strips of 3/4 inch plywood about 9 inches wide, joining these joists to the ones for the second level, effectively building strong C girders. And then the straight part of the central backdrop will also need to be structural. So I would recommend, instead of just a piece of masonite, start off with a sheet of 1/2 inch plywood to anchor all the C pieces together, and then laminate the masonite on top of it. And then at the end of the peninsula there is room behind the backdrop for a couple of 2x4 legs that go all the way from the floor to the second level, thus solving the potential structural problems on the most critical point. Around the walls, the benchwork sections are a maximum of 32 inches deep, and that can easily be handled on heavy-duty shelving brackets, such as the ones that I used on my own layout. The vertical tracks can just be screwed directly into every other stud, giving you a nominal 32-inch spacing, and with the long 22-inch brackets, that will give you plenty of strength. Here is the lower scenic level completed. As you can see, I have filled in this area here, solved the problems that we had before. I have the main line disappear under road bridges at both ends, and then not emerge from the other side as it just goes under the industrial buildings. Such things did happen on the prototype, not particularly often, but it's not unheard of. Now, it's not ideal. If the viewer takes a step back and takes in the entire scene as a whole, the subterfuge will be obvious. But if you just view one end at a time, it'll look a lot more reasonable. Not much has changed here track-wise, although I extended the spur serving Isle-side Industry 2 into a run-round loop, because this switching zone has spurs facing both ways and no convenient place to run round. The area behind the main line has its own run-round loop, so that's a lot easier. And the yard lead at this end of town is extended all the way to the industrial area as a local freight line, giving a short section of 3-track main line. And then there's another yard lead at the other end. I added the crossover at this point because I figured if he has long through trains stopping here to pick up a helper, it makes it a lot easier to get the helper engines out behind it onto the main line. I also filled in the industries in this town, including another one that's been cut open to reveal the interior, although in this case a lot more of the structure is built, so you can encourage viewers to peer much deeper into the structure, whereas the one I did earlier is basically just the front wall and just a few scale feet behind it. Now, something else you may notice on this level is that I drew all the trees in 4 colours. That was in response to a comment that the client made. He said he wanted to go with the seasons, as well as having snow on the highest peaks on the top level. So let's move over there now. Here is the upper scenic level, and as you can see I have extensive snow areas. At one point I had more. I had the snow scene extended all the way to this corner and another peak at the end of the peninsula, but they just didn't look right, so I cut it back a bit. I still think there's plenty of it. And notice how in the corners I've brought the tree line further forward instead of going all the way to the backdrop as I have elsewhere, suggesting that these peaks are above the tree line. I've also avoided bringing any snow-covered trees in front of the rear track, because I want to keep the snow scenes as far away as possible from the lower loop, because as we've already mentioned, the first lap of the room passes around nearer to the bottoms of the valleys. And when I was calculating all the grades and elevations in detail, I realized that instead of being a 1.5 lap helix to get back down to base level, it needs to be a 2.5 lap. So this passing siding ended up at 46 feet instead of 29 feet. And yes, I know in theory you could make it shorter, but that would involve a custom curved turnout. Having the passing siding the entire length of the helix allows us to use conventional number 8 straight turnouts at the ends. And if he wants to, he can park multiple trains in it at the same time. I already mentioned the number of places where the tracks cross over each other in this area. The only one that was a little bit awkward was this end of this trestle where it crosses at a fairly fine angle. So I solved that problem by spreading the 2 tracks and putting an angled pier between them. At this point it's a steeper angle so it can cross them both together. And everywhere I go through the wall on all 4 levels, I've tried to keep it at a fairly reasonable angle to make framing up holes in the wall a lot easier. And here is the sky staging, which if you recall now represents the city of Denver, and I think it's quite appropriate that it does so, because Denver is of course at a fairly high elevation. And I also showed optional overflow staging in this corner. Not only was there room for it, but he still had a load of code 100 number 6 right hand turnouts in his possession, and this uses up all but one of them. And at this point a number 8 left hand turnout is just cut into the easement for the mainline curve. Now in my write-up I did suggest that he doesn't need to build this right away, just install the first turnout and then build this overflow staging if and when he needs it. Well, I think that just about sums up this layout design. I'm just going to page through some higher resolution screenshots without all the annotations defacing them. Feel free to pause on any one of these if you want to look at each level in more detail. There's the lower staging level, the lower scenic level, where virtually everything on this deck represents Salt Lake City, and the upper scenic level, the main line between Salt Lake and Denver, and then of course, as I just mentioned, The sky staging level represents the city of Denver off stage. So I'm just going to wind this video up here. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you again next week. Bye for now.